Marcus Caldwell was 38 years old when a man he had never formally met slid a denial letter across a desk and told him, with the particular confidence of someone who believed they held all the relevant information, that his application did not meet the institution's lending criteria. The man's name was Derek Fontaine, 41 years old, senior loan officer at Meridian Community Bank on Peachtree Industrial in Chamblee, Georgia. He wore a fitted blue shirt with French cuffs and a watch that cost more than the monthly salary of most of the people who walked through the bank's front door. He had been at Meridian for 4 years. He had been sleeping with Marcus's wife for 11 months. He had no idea that the institution whose letterhead was printed on that denial letter had been majority-owned, through a holding structure registered in the name of a Georgia trust, by the man sitting across from him since the previous February. He had no idea that Marcus had walked in that morning carrying a loan application under a name that appeared nowhere in the trust documents, because Marcus had wanted to see something for himself before he decided how to proceed. He had no idea that the quarterly board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. He had no idea that Marcus Caldwell had been many things in his quiet life. But one of the things he had been, for 6 years before anyone in this room had heard of him, was a bank director. What Derek Fontaine did not know could fill the denial letter he had just signed his own name to. What happened next would cost him the career, the title, the watch, and considerably more. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The coffee was still warm when Marcus sat down at the kitchen table that Thursday morning. And the house had the particular quality of a well-maintained thing. The kind of silence that came not from emptiness, but from care. From years of attention paid to the small details that most people stopped noticing once the newness wore off. He had refinished the hardwood floors himself 3 years ago. A weekend job that had become 2 weekends and then 3. Not because the work was beyond him, but because he wanted it done to a standard he could stand behind. The floors showed the grain now the way they were meant to. Nobody had commented on it. He had not done it for comment. He turned the coffee mug in both hands and looked out the window at the backyard, where the garden his grandmother had started him on. A narrow raised bed along the south fence that he had expanded twice since buying the house was coming into its late season. Josephine Caldwell had died 6 years ago at 81 in a hospital room in Decatur, and she had spent the last hour he'd had with her talking not about dying, but about soil preparation and the importance of a deep bed. She had said, in the particular way of a woman who had learned everything she knew by doing it, Marcus, anything worth growing needs more underneath than it shows on top. He had thought about that sentence in boardrooms. He had thought about it in negotiations. He thought about it now. He was a financial systems architect by training and, eventually, by ownership. He had spent 12 years working inside regional banking infrastructure before the opportunity to acquire a minority stake in Meridian had presented itself. And 3 years after that, before a series of careful secondary purchases and one estate-driven forced sale had brought his ownership to 54%, administered entirely through the Josephine Trust, a name he had chosen without anyone asking why. The trust held his name nowhere on its public-facing documents. This was not an accident. He drove a 2019 Camry, gray, with a small dent in the rear quarter panel he had never gotten fixed. His watch was a Seiko his father had left him. His work bag was a canvas messenger bag with a broken buckle he kept meaning to replace. At the Chamber of Commerce mixer where Renata had introduced him to her colleagues 2 years ago, one of them had asked what he did, and he had said financial consulting, and the man had nodded with the minimal interest the answer was designed to produce. Renata came downstairs at 7:30 in her running clothes, with her phone in her hand. She kissed him on the top of his head. Not his cheek, the top of his head. Which was a thing she had done in the early years of the marriage as a form of tenderness, and which had become, he understood now, a form of performance for an audience of one. She opened the refrigerator. She looked at her phone. She put its screen down on the counter with the ease of a woman who had been doing it long enough that it no longer required thought. "You have that appointment today?" she asked. "This morning," he said. "The consulting thing." "Yes." She poured orange juice. She scrolled something on her phone with her back partially to him. "I'll probably be late tonight. Karen and I are doing the thing." "The dinner thing?" He nodded. He finished his coffee. He had met Renata 11 years ago at a financial literacy workshop he had been invited to speak at. Not as the keynote, but as a panelist, one of 4, in a conference room in Buckhead on a Saturday morning. She had been in the audience and had asked the best question of the session. A pointed and specific question about predatory lending structures in underserved communities that had made the other 3 panelists uncomfortable and had made Marcus want to answer her honestly for 30 minutes. She had laughed twice during his answer, not at him, but with him. And afterward she had come to the front of the room and handed him a business card and said she would be interested in continuing the conversation if he was. He had been. He had thought about that question for a long time, the specificity of it, the evidence that she had done the reading. He no longer thought about it the same way. The signal had arrived not as a single moment, but as an accumulation, the way structural problems always did. 3 months ago, a name had appeared in a context where it did not belong. He had been reviewing Meridian's quarterly loan officer performance reports in his home office on a Sunday evening, a habit he maintained to stay current without requiring his presence at the branch level. And in the notes column of one flagged application review, the name Derek Fontaine had appeared with a notation that he had personally expedited a residential refinancing application for a property on Vinings Overlook Drive. Vinings Overlook Drive was where Renata's college roommate, Karen, lived. He had not reacted. He had read the notation again. He had pulled up the application. The borrower's name was not Karen. He had not gone looking for more that evening. He had closed the report and sat in his office for 22 minutes and then gone to bed, but the name had been filed somewhere internal and thorough. 2 weeks later, Renata's phone had buzzed on the nightstand at 2 a.m, and she had reached for it in her sleep with a speed that was not the speed of someone unfamiliar with late-night notifications. She had not opened it, had gone back to sleep, and the screen had gone dark. He had not moved. He had looked at the ceiling and cataloged what he knew. The application had arrived 2 days later. He had filled it out himself under the name of one of his personal LLCs, a small holding entity that predated the Josephine Trust and was, on paper, exactly the kind of modest small business borrower that Meridian existed to serve. He had requested a commercial line of credit of $180,000. A figure well within the institution's normal approval range for the documented assets attached to the LLC. He had driven to the Chambly branch on a Thursday morning in his gray Camry with his canvas bag and taken a seat in Derek Fontaine's office because the receptionist had assigned him there by rotation. He had wanted to see something for himself. He had seen it. Derek Fontaine had reviewed the application for 11 minutes, made 2 phone calls Marcus could not hear through the glass partition, and returned with the expression of a man delivering a verdict he found personally satisfying. The denial letter cited insufficient collateral and an unclear revenue trajectory. Both were demonstrably inaccurate readings of the documents provided. Marcus had looked at him across the desk and thought about the quarterly performance report and Vinings Overlook Drive and a phone buzzing at 2 a.m. and he had felt something settle in him with the finality of a load-bearing decision. He had taken the letter. He had thanked Derek Fontaine for his time. His hands hadn't shaken. He drove back to his home office, sat down, and opened the secure portal that connected him to Meridian's full administrative system. He was a systems architect. He understood that the record of a thing was the thing itself, in every meaningful sense. He pulled Derek Fontaine's personnel file. He pulled his loan approval history. He pulled his access logs, his communications records within the institution's internal system, and his expense submissions for the past 24 months. What he found over the following 4 hours was a picture that clarified the way a photograph clarifies when you find the correct focus. The expedited application on Vining's Overlook Drive had waived 2 standard verification steps. A second application, for a condominium purchase in Smyrna, had been approved 18 months ago at a rate 2 points below the standard institutional floor, with a notation that the variance had been authorized by a manager who, when Marcus checked, had left the institution 14 months ago, and whose digital signature had been applied to the authorization 3 weeks after his departure date. That was not a paperwork error. Across the full review, Marcus identified $340,000 in loans that had been originated or materially modified outside established protocol, with a pattern of beneficiaries that shared, in several cases, overlapping social connections he could map with the address data in the files. He built a timeline. He cross-referenced dates. He added the calendar entries he found in the system for after-hours access to the branch by Fontaine's credentials on 12 occasions that did not correspond to any logged institutional purpose. The picture was complete. He moved with the same deliberate calm that defined all his actions. He opened a new folder on the secure drive. He labeled it simply, Meridian Review, Fontaine. He picked up his phone and called one number. It rang once. "It's Marcus," he said. "I need to meet with the board council before Thursday, tomorrow morning if possible." "I'll make it possible," the voice on the other end said. "My office at 8. He spent the rest of the afternoon and part of the evening working through the documentation, not with urgency, but with the patience of a man who understood that the work was the work and could not be rushed into less than it needed to be. When Renata came home at 9:40 and said she was tired from dinner, he said goodnight and continued working. He did not tell her what he was working on. He was a financial systems architect. He understood that the security of a structure depended entirely on the integrity of the records underneath it. The records were very clear. Franklin Osei was the board counsel for Meridian Community Bank and had been since before Marcus came into ownership. A compact, methodical man of 63 who wore the same style of tortoiseshell glasses he had apparently worn since law school, and who had the professional temperament of a man who had learned to treat surprise as a form of unprofessionalism. He had known Marcus for 4 years, had navigated the acquisition process with him, and had never once asked a question that wasn't the correct question. He reviewed Marcus's documentation from 8:15 to 9:40 without speaking, except to ask, twice, for a page to be passed across the desk. He took no notes. He had the quality of a man storing everything in a system more reliable than paper. When he finished, he set the file down and looked at Marcus. "The signature irregularity on the rate variance authorization is the cleanest angle," he said. "It's also potentially criminal. You want to keep that available, but not lead with it." "I don't want to lead with anything," Marcus said. "I want the board to have a complete picture before Thursday." "The board will have a complete picture." Franklin removed his glasses and set them on the desk. "What is your preferred outcome for the individual?" "Termination for cause, fully documented. Referral to the Georgia Department of Banking and Finance for the authorization irregularities." and a complete review of every loan he touched in 48 months. Franklin nodded. And personally. Marcus looked at him. Personally is a separate matter. Franklin put his glasses back on. It usually is. He pulled a legal pad from his drawer. I'll need your CFO and the external auditor on a call by end of business today. The audit committee chair should be looped before tomorrow morning. Do you want to notify the full board before or at Thursday's meeting? At Thursday's meeting, Marcus said. I want everyone in the room at the same time. Franklin wrote something on the pad. There will be questions about how you came to identify this. I was reviewing quarterly performance reports, Marcus said. That is both accurate and complete. Franklin looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who appreciated precision. Yes, it is, he said. Marcus drove home. He stopped at a gas station for coffee, which he did not usually do, and sat in the parking lot for 12 minutes, not because he needed to collect himself, but because the morning had been productive, and he wanted a moment between the productive morning and what came next. What came next was going home to a house where his wife believed he had spent the morning at a consulting appointment, and where he would eat lunch and answer emails and behave like a man who had learned nothing. He was good at behaving like a man who had learned nothing. He had been doing it, he now understood, for several months. That afternoon he drove to his uncle's house in East Point. Leonard Caldwell was 66, a retired bank examiner, 30 years with the FDIC before he took his pension, and the one person in Marcus's family who had understood, when Marcus described his professional direction, exactly what he was building and why. He was a tall, deliberate man who heated his coffee in the microwave a second time and did not apologize for it, and who had the quality of someone who had spent a career looking at the financial records of institutions and had developed a finely calibrated sense of when something was wrong. He had met Renata 4 times. He had been cordial each time with the specific cordiality of a man withholding a verdict. Marcus sat in Leonard's kitchen and told him most of it. Leonard heated his coffee and listened, and did not offer his expression as commentary. When Marcus finished, Leonard sat down. You've known something for how long? He said. 3 months that something was off. About 2 weeks with the specifics. And you went in personally. I wanted to see it. Leonard looked at him steadily. What did you see? A man who had confused access with ownership, Marcus said. Leonard nodded once, slowly, and turned his mug. Your grandmother used to say that the most dangerous thing in any institution was a person who learned the codes, but not the principles. He looked at Marcus. She meant banking. She meant everything else too. I know. The personal part is in process. Separately. Yes. Leonard nodded again. You need anything from me? No, Marcus said. I just needed to say it out loud to someone who would hear it correctly. Leonard raised his mug slightly, a gesture that meant understood, and they sat in the kitchen for another 20 minutes talking about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of steadiness. That evening, Marcus sat across from Renata at dinner and asked about her day. She told him about a project at work and a disagreement with a colleague in a restaurant she had read about in Virginia Highland. He listened and asked follow-up questions and cleared the plates when they were done. When she went to the living room with her phone tilted at the angle she used when the conversation was one she wanted private, he went to his office and confirmed the Thursday board meeting attendance with Franklin's assistant. Everyone would be present. Preparation was the work. The Meridian Community Bank Board met on the 3rd Thursday of every quarter in the 4th floor conference room of the Chambly branch, a room with a long oak table and south-facing windows that admitted a particular quality of Georgia morning light. Marcus had always appreciated the room, He arrived at 8:15 with Franklin Osei and the external auditor, a woman named Dr. Patricia Mensa, who had conducted financial institution reviews for 20 years and who had spent the previous 2 days with Marcus's documentation and had produced from it a 41-page finding report that was now tabbed and labeled at each board member's place. The 6 board members arrived between 8:20 and 8:30. The audit committee chair, a woman named Sylvia Grant, who had been on the board for 9 years and who had the quality of someone who had seen a great deal and been gratified when the facts matched her instincts, reviewed the first 3 tabs of her copy before the meeting formally opened. Derek Fontaine had been asked by the branch manager to be present at 9 o'clock for what the calendar invitation had described as a compliance review. He arrived at 9:02 in his fitted shirt and French cuffs and stopped at the threshold of the conference room in the way of a man whose body understood the situation before his mind finished processing it. The board members were present. Marcus was at the head of the table. The audit report was open at every seat. Franklin stood. "Mr. Fontaine, please come in and take a seat." Fontaine came in. He sat. He looked at the report in front of him, and then at Marcus, and then back at the report. Dr. Mensa walked through the findings in the order she had organized them. The rate variance authorization irregularities first, with the post-departure signature documentation laid out in sequence. The expedited applications next, with the waived verification steps highlighted. And the pattern analysis last, which mapped the network of beneficiary connections across the flagged loans in a way that was quiet and thorough and did not require interpretation. It simply was what it was. Fontaine's attorney, whom he had apparently called at some point in the past 30 minutes based on the number of times he looked at his phone, arrived at 9:40 and attempted to reframe the authorization irregularities as administrative error. Franklin closed that avenue in 2 sentences. The attorney attempted a second framing. Dr. Mensa produced a second exhibit. The attorney looked at his client. Fontaine looked at Marcus. He had the expression of a man running a calculation that kept returning an answer he didn't want. "You were in my office last Thursday," he said. "I was," Marcus said. "That application was accurate as submitted," Marcus said. "Your review of it was not." He looked at Fontaine with the same calm, level attention he brought to every significant conversation, the attention that contained no heat because it did not need to, because the documentation on every seat at this table was already doing the work that anger would have done less precisely. "You denied that application because of who you believed was sitting across from you. You didn't ask who owned the institution you were operating inside of. That's a due diligence problem, Derek. In my experience, due diligence problems have a way of compounding." Fontaine said nothing. The branch manager placed the termination letter on the table in front of him. The referral documentation for the Georgia Department of Banking and Finance was in a separate envelope beside it. Sylvia Grant, who had not spoken during the meeting, said from her seat at the far end of the table, in a voice that did not require volume to carry, "I think we're done." Marcus gathered his materials. He stood. He buttoned his jacket with the same care he applied to everything. He did not gloat. He did not linger. He was a systems architect, and the system had done what a well-designed system did. It had surfaced what was underneath. He nodded to Franklin and walked out of the room into the south-facing light of the Georgia morning. 9 months had passed like water finding its level. Marcus was in the garden on a Saturday in late October, working along the raised bed his grandmother had started in his imagination, and he had built in the soil of his backyard in Decatur. The bed he had expanded twice since buying the house, which now ran the full length of the south fence and produced more than he needed, which was the point of it. He was pressing garlic into the bed for spring, a slow task, repetitive and exact, the kind of work that allowed the mind to be still without being empty. The house was his alone now. The divorce had concluded in August, cleanly and without drama, which was what happened when the documentation was complete and the legal counsel was prepared, and the other party's attorney understood what the Josephine Trust contained and what it did not. Renata had retained her car, her professional accounts, and the contents of the house she had contributed to the marriage. She had not retained access to anything that had been built before or parallel to it. He had heard through Franklin Osei, who had heard through the board, that Derek Fontaine had not found another position in financial services. The Georgia Department of Banking and Finance referral was proceeding along its own timeline, slow and bureaucratic and permanent. He was working, according to the same chain of information, in a property management role in Gwinnett County. The watch was, presumably, elsewhere. Marcus had not sought the information. It had simply arrived, the way accurate information eventually did. He sat back on his heels and looked at the bed. The garlic was in. The soil was good. He had amended it every fall for 3 years, with the patience of someone who understood that the quality of what grew depended entirely on the quality of what held it. The back door opened, and Diana Sante came out with 2 mugs of coffee, picking her way across the yard in the careful manner of someone not yet familiar with the particular territory of another person's space, but making herself at home in it, honestly. She was a community development attorney who worked on housing access policy in the metro area, and she had met Marcus at a Meridian-sponsored financial literacy event 6 months ago where she had asked him, point blank in front of a room of 30 people, why community banks weren't doing more with their CRA commitments. He had answered her honestly, for 20 minutes. She had come to find him afterward and said the answer was better than she expected, and she wanted to continue the conversation if he was willing. He had been willing. She handed him a mug and looked at the garden. How does it come up in the spring? Slow at first, he said, then all at once. She nodded. She sat in the low chair by the fence and held her mug in both hands, and they were quiet together for a while, which was its own kind of language. The Meridian Quarterly Report was on the kitchen table, filed that morning. The institution's loan approval rate for small business applications had increased by 11% in the 3 quarters since the Fontaine review, and the full audit it had precipitated. Marcus had stood in front of the board 2 months ago and presented a revised lending protocol and a community reinvestment framework that Sylvia Grant had called, in the direct way she had, exactly what this bank should have been doing for the last decade. He had not said much in response. The work said it. The October light moved across the garden. The garlic was in the ground, invisible, doing what planted things did before anyone could see it. Marcus wrapped both hands around the mug. He thought about soil preparation. He thought about depth. He was solvent. He was steady. He was building the right things for the right reasons, and the roots were deeper than anything on the surface suggested. Some things grew exactly as planted, if you gave them the ground they required. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.